My name is Cora Hawthorne, and for the better part of a decade, I have lived a life measured by the tides. At 58, you learn that the grand, dramatic moments are rare. Life is mostly the ebb and flow of small things: the morning mist burning off the water in Port Blossom Bay, the particular shade of blue the hydrangeas turn in late summer, the worn smoothness of a sea glass shard in your palm. I've built a quiet world for myself here, in this small house overlooking the water, a world filled with books, a sprawling, untidy garden, and the steady companionship of the gulls. It is a peace I earned, piece by piece, after the noise of my former life and the louder silence that followed when my son, Leo, decided I no longer existed. Then, on a Tuesday that felt no different from any other, the peace was disturbed. It wasn't a storm or a sudden tragedy, just the soft thud of a package on my porch. Not the usual hurried drop from the delivery driver, but a deliberate, quiet placement. I watched through the window as a nondescript sedan pulled away from the curb, too quickly for me to see the driver. On the welcome mat sat a simple craft paper box, tied with a single strand of forest green satin ribbon. My name was written on a small, unadorned tag, Cora Hawthorne. The handwriting was as familiar to me as my own reflection, and just as unnerving to behold after so long. It was Leo's. Each letter was a marvel of architectural precision, stark and upright, with no flourish, no wasted ink. It was the handwriting of a person who saw the world in lines and angles, who believed sentiment was an inefficient curve. I hadn't seen it in 5 years. Not on a birthday card, not on a note of condolence when my brother passed, not even in a text message. 5 years of a silence so complete, it had become a presence in my house, like a piece of furniture I'd learned to walk around. I carried the box inside and set it on my small, sun-bleached kitchen table. It seemed alien there, amidst the comfortable clutter of my life: a stack of seed catalogs, a half-finished mug of chamomile tea, a chipped pottery bowl filled with stones from the beach. For a long while, I just looked at it. The tea went cold. The sun shifted, casting a long shadow from the box across the floor. Part of me, the part that had been a mother for 30 years, felt a flicker of hope so sharp it was painful. Another, newer part of me, the part that had learned to survive his absence, was wary. Leo never did anything without a reason, and his reasons were rarely simple. Curiosity, or perhaps the ghost of a mother's hope, finally made me pull at the ribbon. Inside the box, nestled in crisp, white tissue paper, was a collection of exquisite macarons. There were at least 24 of them, arranged in perfect rows of pastel color: pale rose, lavender, pistachio green, and a soft, buttery yellow. They were flawless. Each one was a tiny, perfect jewel, some dusted with edible gold, others with a single, crystallized flower petal placed in the center. Leo, who I couldn't recall ever voluntarily entering a kitchen for any purpose other than to critique my organizational system, had apparently become a master pastry chef. Taped to the inside of the lid was a small, plain card. 2 words in that same precise script: for you. I felt a tightening in my chest, a familiar ache of wanting to believe in the gesture while my intuition whispered a warning. Love from Leo had always been conditional, transactional. A good report card earned a smile. A clean room earned a nod of approval. A deviation from his expectations earned a chilling withdrawal that could last for days. His affection was a currency, and I had long ago gone bankrupt. I didn't eat one. I couldn't. It felt like accepting a treaty without reading the terms. The macarons were too beautiful, too perfect, too out of character. It was a performance, and I no longer had the energy to be the audience. Instead, I carefully slid one of the lavender macarons into a small glass container and placed it in the back of the refrigerator, a silent acknowledgement of the gesture, nothing more. The rest, I decided, would not go to waste. Annalise, Leo's mother-in-law, lived a few towns over in a cheerful yellow house with a garden that rivaled my own. We had forged an unlikely friendship over the years, a bond built in the quiet spaces Leo and her daughter, Clara, left behind in their whirlwind of ambition. Annalise was a warm, generous soul who deserved a sweet, uncomplicated pleasure. Giving her the macarons felt right, like redirecting a current that had flowed to the wrong shore. That afternoon, I drove to her home. The coastal highway was shimmering in the late afternoon sun, the ocean a vast expanse of glittering blue to my left. Annalise was delighted, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the beautiful pastries. She insisted I stay for tea, and we sat in her sunroom, talking about her prize-winning roses and my battle with the slugs in my lettuce patch. I didn't mention Leo. The box had been from an anonymous admirer, a secret bakery, I'd said with a wave of my hand. The lie felt kinder than the truth. Driving home as dusk settled, a sense of relief washed over me. The box was gone from my table. The gesture had been acknowledged and passed on. I had, I thought, navigated the moment with grace. I had maintained my boundaries while still being kind. I felt a quiet sense of pride in that. I was no longer the woman who would have wept with gratitude and eaten every last one, desperate for the crumbs of his affection. I had grown. The next morning, my phone rang as I was watering the ferns on my porch. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in half a decade. Leo. My heart gave a painful jolt. My hand trembled as I swiped to answer, the plastic of the phone suddenly slick in my grip. Hello. My voice was steadier than I expected. Mother. His voice was smooth, familiar, and carried a casual warmth that was entirely manufactured. It was the voice he used for business associates and people he wanted to impress. I trust the package arrived safely. Leo. Yes, it did. Thank you. It was a surprise. I sat down on the porch steps, the damp wood cool against my legs. I've taken up baking, he said, a note of self-satisfaction in his tone. A study in precision and chemistry. I find it relaxing. They were beautiful, I said, choosing my words with care. There was a pause, a carefully calibrated beat of silence before the real question. So you enjoyed them? I took a deep breath of the salty air. This was the test. I could lie, tell him what he wanted to hear, and smooth the waters. The old me would have. But the old me was tired. Actually, I said, my voice quiet but firm, I didn't have any. I gave them to Annalise. You know how she adores sweets. I knew she'd appreciate them. The silence on the other end of the line was no longer calibrated. It was a void. It was so absolute I thought the call had dropped. I pulled the phone away from my ear to check the screen. The timer was still ticking. You, what? His voice, when it returned, was unrecognizable. The smooth, professional veneer had cracked, and underneath was something sharp and cold. I gave them to Annalise, I repeated slowly, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I was visiting her yesterday and brought them as a gift. You gave them away. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, heavy with a rage that vibrated through the phone. Leo, what's wrong? They were a gift. I shared them. They weren't for her, he hissed, the words tight and venomous. They weren't for anyone else. They were for you. Only you. The force of his anger was a physical blow. I felt my breath catch. I don't understand. Of course you don't, he spat, the bitterness thick and choking. You never understand. You take what is mine, what is meant for a specific purpose, and you just give it away. You ruin everything with your sentimentality. He hung up. The abrupt dial tone was shrill in the quiet morning air. I slowly lowered the phone, my hand shaking. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Only you. The words echoed in my head, not as a declaration of love, but as a pronouncement of something sinister. I walked numbly back into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The little glass container was still there. Inside, the single lavender macaron sat, a perfect, innocent-looking thing. I stared at it, a cold fear beginning to seep into my bones. What had I done? Just as I was closing the refrigerator door, the landline on the wall, a relic I kept mostly for emergencies, began to ring. Its shrill, old-fashioned jangle made me jump. I picked it up, a sense of profound dread washing over me. Cora. It was Clara, Leo's wife. Her voice was thin and frayed with panic. Clara? What is it? It's Mom, she said, her voice breaking. It's Annalise. She's in the hospital. She collapsed this morning. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the world tilting slightly on its axis. What happened? I don't know. She was fine last night. This morning she was nauseous, dizzy. Then she started vomiting. She was so disoriented, she couldn't stand up. The paramedics just took her to St. Jude's. The doctors, they don't know what it is. They're running tests. There was a pause, and I could hear the sterile, beeping sounds of a hospital in the background. Cora, did she eat anything unusual yesterday? Anything at all? My mouth was dry. I could barely form the words. I brought her some macarons. Macarons. Yes. A gift. From a bakery. The life felt like ash in my mouth. She mentioned them, Clara said, her voice distant. She said they were the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. She ate 2 or 3 of them with her tea after you left. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Clara, I have to go, she interrupted, her voice strained. They need me to sign some forms. I'll call you when I know more. The line went dead. I sat in the silent kitchen, the sun streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Everything was exactly as it had been 5 minutes ago, but the world had fractured. The beautiful, perfect macarons. Leo's terrifying rage. Annalise, lying in a hospital bed. The connections clicked into place with horrifying certainty. I moved as if in a trance. I walked to the front door, where I'd shaken out the welcome mat that morning. The craft paper wrapping from the box was in the recycling bin. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. As I smoothed the paper on the counter, something small and hard rolled out from a crease and fell to the floor with a tiny click. It was a small glass vial, no bigger than my thumb, with a black screw-on cap. It was empty, but when I held it up to the light, I could see a faint, crystalline residue clinging to the inside. There was no label. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before in my life. My gaze went to the refrigerator. To the single lavender macaron in its glass tomb. My breath hitched. Was I the intended recipient of whatever had been in that vial? Was that beautiful, perfect gift box meant to be my coffin? The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that my mind shied away from it. But the evidence was laid out on my kitchen table. The vial, the memory of Leo's voice, and the news of Annalise. I needed to know. Not just for Annalise, but for myself. For my own sanity. I thought of my old friend, Dr. Isabel Reed, a botany professor at the local university. We'd met in a community gardening class years ago and bonded over a shared love for heirloom tomatoes. Her specialty was plant toxicology. I wrapped the macaron and the vial carefully in a clean cloth, placed them in a zip-top bag, and put them in my purse. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, clear purpose. The gentle, reflective woman who tended her garden and collected sea glass had been replaced by someone else. Someone who understood that survival sometimes required you to look directly at the monster you had accidentally unleashed. I had to know what was in that macaron. And I had to know what I was going to do about the man I once called my son. The university lab was quiet, smelling of sterilizing alcohol and damp earth. Isabel met me in her office, her kind face etched with concern when she saw my expression. She was a practical woman, with intelligent eyes and hands perpetually stained with soil. "Cora, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, guiding me to a chair. "Something like that," I whispered. I placed the bag on her desk between a stack of academic journals and a tray of seedlings. "Isabel, I need a favor. A very big, very quiet favor. I need you to test this." I pointed to the macaron. "And tell me if there's anything in it that shouldn't be." She looked from my face to the bag. She didn't ask why. She didn't press for details. She simply saw the desperation in my eyes and nodded. "The vial too?" "Yes. I found it with the packaging." "All right," she said, her voice low and serious. "This will go to the top of my queue. I'll run a full-spectrum analysis. It might take a day or 2. I'll call you the second I have anything." I left the university feeling hollowed out. The drive back to Port Blossom was a blur of scenery I didn't see. My mind was a maelstrom of memories, re-examining Leo's childhood through this new, horrific lens. I saw him not as a sensitive, particular child, but as a boy who craved absolute control. I remembered the time he meticulously organized my spice rack alphabetically, then refused to speak to me for a week when I put the cinnamon back in the wrong place. I remembered his cold fury when a classmate accidentally smudged his perfect, prize-winning science project. He hadn't yelled. He'd simply stared at the boy with an unnerving stillness, and the next day, the boy's locker had been systematically vandalized, his textbooks destroyed with ink. No one could ever prove it was Leo. He was too smart, too careful. Back then, I'd called it intensity. I'd told myself he was a perfectionist, that his brilliance came with quirks. I had made excuses. I had buffered him from the world, and the world from him. What had I created? The question was a physical weight in my chest. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended animation. I couldn't eat. I couldn't read. I just sat in my armchair, watching the tide go out and come back in, the rhythm of the waves a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. Clara called with an update. Annalise's condition was worsening. Her neurological and cardiac functions were erratic. The doctors were baffled. They tested for everything: botulism, stroke, rare viruses. Nothing. They were treating her symptoms, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. I listened, my heart aching with guilt and a rising tide of fury. The call from Isabel came the following afternoon. I answered on the first ring. "Cora," she said, and her voice was grim. I knew. "I have the results." I braced myself. "Tell me." "It's aconite," she said softly. "Wolfsbane. A potent cardiotoxin and neurotoxin, derived from the monkshood plant. It's a classic poison, Cora. Highly controlled. Odorless, difficult to detect without specific tests. A minuscule amount can be lethal. The residue in the vial matches the traces I found concentrated in the macarons filling." She paused. This was not an accident. This was deliberate, and it was done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I closed my eyes, the receiver cold against my ear. Aconite. Wolfsbane. The name itself sounded like something from a dark fairy tale. My son, the meticulous baker, had chosen his ingredients with care. My son had tried to murder me. And Annalise, dear, sweet Annalise, had taken the blow meant for me. "Cora? Are you still there?" "Yes," I said, my voice a thread. "Thank you, Isabel. You need to report this." "I already have," she said gently. "Standard protocol for a finding like this. I gave your name as the source of the sample. A Detective Morales from the county sheriff's office will be contacting you." After we hung up, I stood in the center of my living room for a long time. The house, my sanctuary, felt different. Violated. The veil of my quiet, peaceful life had been torn away, revealing the ugly reality I had refused to see for years. Leo was not just estranged. He was not just angry. He was dangerous. The decision to cooperate with the police was not difficult. The woman I was 5 years ago might have hesitated, might have tried to protect him, to handle it herself. But that woman was gone. She had died a little bit each day of his silence, and now this act had buried her completely. In her place was a woman who understood that her survival and the safety of others depended on facing the truth, no matter how monstrous. Detective Morales was younger than I expected, with a calm, steady gaze that missed nothing. He came to my house, declining my offer of tea, and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the box of macarons had sat just days before. He listened patiently as I recounted the entire story, from the arrival of the package to Isabel's phone call. I gave him the wrapping paper and told him about the nondescript sedan. I played him the voicemail I had saved, the one where Leo's voice turned from smooth to venomous. My own voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if I were narrating a story that had happened to someone else. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said when I had finished, his tone professional but not unkind. "Do you have any idea why your son would want to harm you?" I looked out the window at the gray, churning water of the bay. "He resents me," I said softly. "I think he always has. His father left when he was young. We struggled financially. I wasn't the mother he thought he deserved. I was imperfect. And Leo does not tolerate imperfection." I paused, then added, "And there's the inheritance. My brother left me a considerable sum a few years ago. It passes to Leo upon my death." Morales made a note on his pad. "We've spoken to the hospital. With the information from Dr. Reed, They've confirmed aconite poisoning in Mrs. Fournier's system. They've adjusted her treatment. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. A sliver of relief pierced my numbness. Annalise might live. But to move forward with an investigation against your son, he continued, we need more than a poisoned macaron and a resentful motive. We need to connect him directly to the poison. I knew what I had to do. It was a terrifying thought, a risk that made my blood run cold. But I also knew Leo. I knew his arrogance, his belief in his own intellectual superiority. He would believe he was untouchable. I think I can get you that, I said. The next day, I drove to the city. Leo lived in a minimalist high-rise apartment that felt more like a laboratory than a home. Everything was glass and steel and shades of gray. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of a life lived, only a life curated. I had my phone in my coat pocket, the recording app silently running. He opened the door, his face a mask of polite concern. Mother, I wasn't expecting you. I was in the city for an appointment, I lied smoothly. I wanted to see how you were. And Clara. This whole thing with Annalise must be terrible for you both. He led me into the sterile living room. It's been difficult. Clara is a wreck. She's at the hospital now. I'm so sorry we got off on the wrong foot the other day, I said, arranging my features into an expression of maternal regret. I was just so surprised by the gift. They really were exquisite. Annalise thought so, too. Before she got sick, of course. I watched him carefully. He gave a slight, dismissive shrug. A bad case of the flu, the doctors think. Perhaps, I said, letting a beat of silence pass. She did mention one of them was her absolute favorite. The lavender one, with the little flecks of silver dust. She said it had the most unusual, delicate flavor. There it was. A flicker in his eyes. A tightening at the corner of his mouth, so fleeting I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. He thought he was unreadable, but I had spent 30 years learning his tells. The lavender, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. She always did have a taste for the dramatic. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had only saved one macaron, the lavender one. Annalise had never seen it, let alone eaten it. You're a true artist, Leo, I continued, my voice trembling slightly. I can't imagine where you learned to bake like that. Or where you'd even find such exotic ingredients. I paused, looking him directly in the eye. Like wolfsbane. He didn't flinch. He simply went very, very still. The mask didn't slip, it hardened into something impenetrable. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice as cold and sterile as the room around us. And I think you should leave. Spreading rumors like that at a time like this, it's cruel. Even for you. You're right, I said, standing up, my bag in my hand. I should go. As I turned, my eyes swept the kitchen counter. And I saw it. Partially hidden behind a canister of artisanal coffee beans was another small, brown glass vial, identical to the one I'd found in my recycling. He saw me look. He took a half step, a subtle, instinctive movement to block my view. I walked to the door, my legs unsteady. I didn't look back. I didn't stop the recording until I was safely in my car, doors locked, halfway back to Port Blossom. I emailed the audio file to Detective Morales with a simple message. Here is your connection. The arrest was quiet. There were no sirens, no dramatic standoff. They picked him up at his office. He went without protest, his expression, according to the detective, one of mild annoyance, as if he were being inconvenienced by a minor bureaucratic error. When they searched his apartment, they found the vial on the counter. It contained traces of aconite. They also found a hidden compartment in his desk containing several dried monkshood plants and a notebook filled with chillingly precise notes on extraction methods, dosages, and their effects. His computer's search history was a litany of toxicological research. He had been planning it for months. Annalise slowly, miraculously recovered. The antidote, administered just in time, saved her life. But she was changed, frilier, the memory of what happened a permanent shadow in her eyes. Clara filed for divorce before the trial even began. She came to my house one afternoon, her face pale and drawn, and we sat together on my porch, watching the waves. She cried for the man she thought she had married, and I cried for the son I realized I had never truly known. In the end, it was his own arrogance that condemned him. The slip about the lavender macaron, the meticulous notes, the belief that he was too clever to be caught. The trial was short. He was found guilty of the attempted murder of Annalise Fournier and the attempted murder of Cora Hawthorne. The day after the sentencing, I went down to the beach. The tide was low, revealing a wide expanse of wet sand littered with shells and stones. I walked for a long time, the cold wind on my face. The world felt both vast and incredibly intimate. I thought about the lavender macaron, which Detective Morales had returned to me, sealed in an evidence bag. It was a strange, grim relic. When I got home, I built a small, hot fire in the hearth. I took the macaron out of its plastic bag and looked at it one last time. It was a symbol of so many things, of hatred disguised as beauty, of a love so twisted it had become poison, of a boundary that had saved my life. And then I threw it into the flames. I watched until it was nothing but ash. I am still Cora Hawthorne. I still live in the house overlooking the water. My life is still measured by the tides, by the turning of the seasons in my garden, by the color of the evening sky. The silence in my house is different now. It is not the heavy, oppressive silence of an absence, but the clean, quiet space of peace. I have learned that self-respect is not selfishness, and that setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, but an act of profound self-love. I was 58 when my son tried to kill me. I am 59 now. The world did not break me. I am no longer a mother grieving a son she lost. I am a woman who has found herself, standing on a shore she now knows is her own.